So my name is Chris Dwyer. I'm the executive director here at the building, and we're glad to have everyone here. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with Mr. Smith. He was an inspiration to me when I was teaching at St. Vincent Pallotti High School. I was teaching speech and debate, and I was able to, help communicate with my students the importance of speaking articulately and also to realize that you have a contribution to the world. Like everybody's got a voice, everybody's got an experience, and it's important to share that and be proud of it and also learn from it. So Mr. Smith was a very big inspiration to me and my students. I'm very fortunate to have moved on from St. Vincent Pallotti High School, which is a fabulous place. I just want to tell you that. Thank you. It is a fabulous place. To an even more fabulous place here at the Bowie Center for the Performing Arts. Now, a lot of you might also know Mr. Joe Clair. He has a monthly comedy show here at the Bowie Center for the Performing Arts, and we're very fortunate to have him. I'm very excited to have the both of them on stage together. So we're going to start out. Mr. Smith is going to do a reading from his book here at the podium, and then we're just going to have a conversation with Joe Clair and Clint Smith. We will be able to do a Q&A for about 10 minutes at the end of this program. So if you have any questions or some thoughts that you would like to share with us, please hold on to those, and we will find you towards the end of this program. All right. Thank you all so much.
So for those who aren't familiar with How the Word is Passed, it came out in 2021, and it is about how different historical sites across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. It started in 2017 when I saw several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.D. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And thinking about what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. Now, my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. And my parents still live on a street named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography, they're not just symbols, but they're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that community carry. And these narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which doesn't mean that if you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize, I think, the ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help collectively ground our understanding of American history and give us a sense of the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. And so I go to several places across the United States, a Confederate cemetery, Monticello Plantation, Whitney Plantation, Louisiana. I mentioned one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country. I go to Galveston, Texas. I go to New York City. I go all over the place, trying to make sense of how different groups of people tell the story of slavery and to what extent they are honest, to what extent they are dishonest, and to what extent they're doing something sort of in between. And hopefully Joe and I will be able to talk about some of those places in our conversation. And the other thing that happened this year is that Above Ground, which is my newest poetry collection, came out. So I had a poetry collection that came out in 2017 or 2016, Counting Descent. How the Word is Passed came. Thank you very much. How the Word is Passed came out in 2021, and then this came out this year in April in 2023. And a lot of what Above Ground is thinking about is what I talk about is the sort of simultaneity of the human experience, which is to say how we move through the world, we move through life carrying joy and love and laughter in the same moment, in the same body that we carry despair, anxiety, and fear. And what does it mean to live and navigate both of those, living in your body, streams, moving and coursing through your veins at the very same time, and specifically through context and through the lens of parenting is one of the things that I was interested in exploring. That I have a 6 and a 4-year-old, and a lot of what I've been thinking about are how parenting, if you choose to embark on that journey, is one of the most remarkable, beautiful, inspiring experiences you can ever have. It's also one of the hardest and one of the most exhausting and one of the most difficult, one of the most humbling. And Joe, we were talking backstage, and I was like, Joe, man, my wife's talking about a third. He was like, and so, but I'm interested in what it means to hold both of those realities at once, to not pretend that parenting is just this thing that's like all roses and flowers and butterflies, or that it's just this thing that's only hard, only kids complaining, but it's both. And every day is filled with um, the mix of that, the simultaneity of that. And I think that for me, that's what I'm interested in more broadly. I have poems that I've, written. I've been writing poems for 15, 20 years now. And I think about poems that I wrote a long time ago. And I had this friend, Safia Hilo, who's a beautiful poet and novelist. And I was like, man, Safia, like sometimes think about those poems that I wrote in like 2005 when I was in college. And like, they're terrible. They're trash. Like, I can't even look at them. Like, I will go on YouTube and look. I don't go on YouTube and I don't look at them because they're that bad. And she's like, well, you could think about them as like being terrible or being trash, or you could think about them as sort of time capsules that allow you to get a sense of who you were at this point in your life, and what a blessing it is, what a miracle it is to have these sort of breadcrumbs through poetry that allows you to trace who you've been and how you've thought about the world throughout these different periods of your life. And I was like, it's a much more generous rendering than like these poems are trash. But I've been struck by that, and that stayed with me, this idea of the poem as time capsule. And what these poems have been for me, what so much of my writing more broadly is for me, is an attempt to capture a moment in time, a feeling, an observation, a period of history, a sensation, a conversation, and to hold it and to sort of home in on it and to explore it with specificity, granularity, to examine like what it means and how it impacts my life. And I did a lot of that in this book through the lens of parenthood and fatherhood. So I've been talking a lot. I'm gonna read some of these poems, and then we're gonna hop into conversation, and then we will see how the evening goes. So this first poem is called All at Once, which is the first poem in the book, and I think really is the sort of thesis statement of the project, and captures that idea of holding multiplicity, holding complexity in our bodies, in our lives, in our stories, all together. Also, sometimes people go to poetry readings, and there's this thing where the poet will read the poem, and then they finish the poem, and the people just stare at them. Please don't do that. Like, look, even if you don't like the poem, even if you're like, that poem is subpar, please clap after. Otherwise, like, it's awkward for me, it's awkward for you. I came up in the spoken word scene in DC, and that's kind of what brought me to literature. And maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. But this place, when I was a teacher in PG County, I was going to spoken word spots and poetry spots in DC every single night, and so that community shaped me. And as for anybody who's ever been to a spoken word spot, like, it's a very engaging, active sort of community based on so much of the call and response of the Black church and things like that. So again, if it's a bad poem, just don't let me know. Just keep it up. All at Once. The redwoods are on fire in California. A flood submerges a neighborhood that sat quiet on the coast for 3 centuries. A child takes their first steps and tumbles into a father's arms. 2 people in New Orleans fall in love under an oak tree whose branches bend like sorrow. A forest of seeds are planted in new soil. A glacier melts into the ocean and the sea climbs closer to the land. A man comes home from war and holds his son for the first time. A man is killed by a drone that thinks his jug of water is a bomb. Your best friend relapses and isn't picking up the phone. Your son's teacher calls to say he stood up for another boy in class. A country below the equator ends a 20-year civil war. A soldier across the Atlantic fires the shot that begins another. The scientists find a vaccine that will save millions of people's lives. Your mother's cancer has returned, and the doctors say there is nothing else they can do. There's a funeral procession in the morning and a wedding in the afternoon. The river that gives us water to drink is the same one that might wash us away. One of the things that parenthood has done for me is that it has really opened up it has stretched my capacity for empathy. I think that when things happen across the world, even, today, the devastation of the earthquake in Morocco, for example, and you think what it has done is allows me to imagine with a different sense of emotional proximity, like what it would be like if that happened to my children. How, what happened today would happen somewhere every day. It's happening to children's and families just like mine. And but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, we very easily could find ourselves in the same situation. And so I've been thinking a lot about how parenthood has, in its own way, even though sometimes I think the nuclear family and children can draw us more inward, so that we'll focus more on our family and almost less on the outer world. For me, it's almost had the opposite effect in that it has made me more cognizant and less parochial, right? My sensibilities of what's happening in the world are far more expansive than they once were. And so I'm going to read these 3 poems that kind of speak to that phenomenon. I'm going to read these back to back as a sort of suite of poems, so you don't have to clap between each one. And then we'll go from there. The drone. The drone was once a scrap of metal. The drone looks as if it might be a toy. The drone is not a toy. The drone could have been something else, something other than the killing machine. The drone could have been a house. The drone could have been a spoon. The drone could have been a swing. The drone does not know who it is going to kill next. The drone is going to kill next. The drone has learned to disguise itself as a shard of sky. The drone's hum is a disembodied echo. The drone was mistaken for a star once. The drone renders itself celestial. The drone scoffs at sovereignty. The drone asks, what is a border if you can fly right over it? The drone was built by a man. The drone killed a man and a woman and a child. The drone killed a child and did not see her face. The drone does not see a face. The drone sees a body, and then the body is gone. Pangea. Imagine each continent, a splendid tessellation of wayward fragments, each mass of land attempting to jostle itself free. Pangea was the last of the supercontinents, a mass of land that came together and broke itself apart several times before. It should come as no surprise. Don't we all eventually return to something we can lose ourselves inside of? Can we blame the desert for missing the breeze that tumbles across the grassland? Can we blame the tundra for its desire to witness the wrestling of pines? Just the other day, a bomb killed 70 people across the sea and no one around me heard a sound. These days, I find myself blaming Pangea for the sounds I cannot hear. I decry the continents for their careless drift. I detest the tectonic plates for their indifferent quake. I wake up in love with the ocean and fall asleep despising all that is put between us. Perhaps if the continents had never shaken themselves free, we might find ourselves disabused of this apathy. Perhaps if we could hear the bomb dropping, we might imagine what would happen if it struck our own home. I am nostalgic for a proximity that may not have mattered. I find myself loathing a miracle. The New York Times reports that 200 civilians have just been killed in U.S. military airstrikes, and the man on television calls it unfortunate yet inevitable collateral damage. And I wonder what it is that turns mourning into a metonym or a proclamation of conjecture. And I read his bio, and I see that he has a wife, and I can't imagine he would call it inevitable if her body were pulled from the rubble. And I see that he has a son, and I can't imagine he will call the boy who bears his name collateral in someone else's war. And I see that he has a daughter, and I think of what it might mean for someone to render her final breath in inevitability of realpolitik. And I understand what he means. I know he means that war is callous and unforgiving, that a militant can surround himself with a dozen women and children so that the pilot must decide between a target and the ache of his own heart's detonation. I do not misunderstand the cruelty of war, but I regret the way we talk about its casualties, how their lives become tacit admonitions, how the tyranny of a border made out of thin air means bombs are only dropped on one side of it. But I too have felt the empathy corrode inside my most cavernous parts, have taken the quarters from my pocket and used them to cover my collusion. Who among us has not used spare change to cover our contrition, or laid a wreath of sympathy atop bodies with names we do not know? And I'm not sure what it means for us, not to be the one to fire the bullet, but to behave as if the bullet always belonged in that chest and not our own. So I said that, so much of what the poems do is act as a time capsule. And it's not only that they act as a sort of time capsule to capture how I'm feeling at a given moment in time, whether about drones or warfare or what's happening across the world, but also about the small moments that are happening in my home with my own children. And one of those things is that every Friday night, we have pizza night, we watch a movie, and then after that, we have a dance party. Unfortunately, my children have no rhythm, which is like cute when they're 6 and 4, but will be devastating if it continues. That's why I got to bring them out to PG County, man. I'm like, you've been in Montgomery County too long. You need to get out of there. And so this poem is about our Friday night dance parties. Sometimes in the evenings after dinner, after the spaghetti has been slurped and I have bribed the broccoli into their bellies, I give both of my children the look. When my eyes meet theirs, they know what time it is. They push in their chairs, they stretch their legs, and we move the table to the far end of the dining room to clear space for what we all know is coming. Alexa, play the post-dinner dance party playlist. And within seconds, Martha Wash's booming voice rolls like thunder over our bodies. Everybody dance now. The electronic keyboard and the drums meet in the middle of the room like two dinosaurs ready to claim the kitchen as their own. Immediately, the jumping begins, and my daughter is flinging her limbs like an offbeat octopus, hands slapping the air behind her as if she is trying to smack anyone who enters her sacred space. I turn around and my son is doing the robot, or is being eaten by a robot, or is trapped in a universe where robots take over the bodies of little boys in peanut butter pajamas. Nonetheless, there is a robot somewhere, and my children, bless them, have not yet learned how to clap on the 2 and 4, so I laugh, but also cringe, as their small hands make a mockery of the melody around them. Now, halfway through the song, everyone is jumping, and I, caught up in the ecstasy of this moment, fall to the ground and convince this no longer young body that it is a good idea to start doing the worm. And when my children see me, their eyes become pools of possibility, and it is clear they see this as a clarion call to climb onto my back. And now, here we are, this strange trifecta, this unlikely trio, a robot and an octopus riding on the back of a worm who will certainly need some Tylenol before bed. And it is in this moment that their mother comes home. And when she opens the door, everyone is screaming, the speakers are blasting, and the percussion is shaking every wall around us. We look up at her, and she looks down at us, and we have no explanation for this strange scene, only an invitation for her to join. So I'm gonna read this last one, which kind of brings everything together a little bit. So for me, poetry, whether I write for the Atlantic magazine, I wrote a book of nonfiction, but I also have these 2 books of poetry. For me, poetry is my North Star. It's like how I started as a writer, again, in these dive bars and these open mic spots here in DC and New Orleans. And it sort of orients me as a writer, orients my thinking, it orients my the sort of music I aim for in my language. And when I was working on How the Word is Passed, even before it became a book of nonfiction, I was writing poems to sort of, as a way both, because for me, poems are both the creation of art, but also the mechanism through which I do my best thinking. And so I wrote poems to try to clarify like what I was trying to say, what this project was trying to do. And I, dozens and dozens of poems that, no one will ever see, but were necessary for my own sort of artistic process. But the thing is that sometimes when you're a poet writing a book of nonfiction, sometimes you'll write a poem and you'll be like, oh, that's good. And then you'll turn the stanzas into the paragraphs and throw it in at the end of one of your chapters and hope your editor doesn't notice. And so this poem that I'm going to read is both in one of the poems that gave me a lot of clarity about what I wanted How the Word is Passed to be, but also is a sort of excerpt from the end of one of my chapters in the book. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of the city. These copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city that is filled with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederate soldiers and slaveholders. Every day, Black people walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human, go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of Black soldiers who were trying to surrender, take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of Black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation, make the first right on the man who mounted the heads of rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? Thank you.
I'm honored that they asked me to do this kind of thing. And as we were talking backstage, I have an affinity for writers. My mother is a writer who started here in Prince George's County, who took herself around the world, writing novels and things of that nature. And for me as a kid to watch somebody actually do that. She started when I was 10 years old. She came on one day and said, "I'm gonna be a writer." And I was like, nobody becomes a writer. Like, do you really, does that really? And I really watched her do it. And I always am in awe of people who can do it and do it at this level. So thank you for having me and allowing me to be part of this evening. I want to start, I need to start with the word granularity. It is it's one of those words that make my ears come alive. And I always marvel at where did the guy come from who uses the word granularity? I mean, let's be quite honest. How often have you heard the word granularity in everyday speech? What tying what I just said about my mom together to where you are right now and using this word granularity, what is it about you that made you become a writer in the first place?
It's a good question. So I remember in 3rd grade, I had a teacher called Miss Mueller, named Miss Mueller. And we had this is my first memory of writing a poem. And Miss Mueller came, we had to write a poem about a color. Like we had to pick a color and write a poem about it. And I chose the color gray. I don't know why, I was a strange child, but, and so I wrote this poem and I remember it kind of going like this. It was, I hate the color gray. It reminds me of a rainy day. Gray, I really hate that color. It's annoying, like my little brother. Me and my brother have a great relationship now. He was a toddler then, you know. But I remember Miss Mueller came over to me. She was going around sort of, I guess looking at everybody's poem. She came over, looked over my shoulder at the poem, put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, "Clint, that was beautiful. You can be a writer when you grow up." she could have said that to every kid in the room. I have no idea. But I remembered that moment for the rest of my life. Which doesn't mean, I don't mean to create some like neat linear, like that was the moment that like, served as catalyst for everything. But it existed in the back of my head forever. And when I became a teacher, I thought about that moment all the time because I was reminded that like, she might have forgotten that she said that moments after she said it. But I remembered it forever. And it was just a reminder for me that young people will remember, like you don't know what a young person will remember that you say, some throwaway comment, something you didn't even mean, but it taught me a lot to be intentional about the sort of language I use, specifically with my students. And so, I've just always been drawn to, when I was a kid, I was writing little poems and limericks and then when I came to DC and was a teacher in Prince George's, I mean, I was just so enmeshed in the spoken word and slam poetry community here. And so much of the focus, because it's an auditory experience, is on the sort of music and the rhythm of the language.
Which brings me to my next question. How did you become a poet and writer and not a rapper? Because let's keep it. These days, teacher says to you, hey, you could be a writer one day. Next thing is, well, I'm getting me changed. This means rapper time. I need a beat. Why didn't you become a rapper?
I'm not good at rapping. I mean, to be frank, like, I have friends who, one of my best friends in high school was like a good rapper. And like, we'd have freestyle battles and it was mostly a very single, he was battling me and I was losing. That's what was happening. But no, I think there's obviously so much crossover between the two. And, some of our greatest poets are rappers, and have been for, 50 years. The hip hop has kind of been around. But I think that, for me, I've long been interested in like what it means to write across different genres, right? So like, what does it mean to try to write poetry and try to write essays and try to write novels and try to write plays and try to, and I just, and I think mom and pops, were kind of, if maybe there was a time when I thought I was going to be a rapper and they were like, no, you're not. And so I think I'm the third. I think Clint Jr. I think he nipped it in the butt pretty early.